Hey everybody, welcome back to Behind the Veil. This is the first episode in our Why I Left the LDS Church series, where we're sharing our own personal stories. And we want to hear from you. So if you'd like to share your experience and possibly be featured in a future episode, you can send us your stories at stories@churchexpositor.com.
I was actually born into Mormonism. I was the first child of very, very devout parents. And I was the only child for 6 years. So there was a lot of focus on me. Both of my parents came from single mother homes, and they carried the weight of a lot of unresolved childhood trauma into their adult years. They never had the tools to process what they had been through. Therapy was never offered as an option for them. Vulnerability was never modeled for them. It was just be quiet, don't bother your mother. And as a result, they both became very emotionally immature adults who placed the burden of perfection and spiritual worthiness squarely on my shoulders as a child. This emotional immaturity also led to abusive situations as well, which I'm not going to talk a lot about because that's not the focus of the story, but it does have a small bit of relevance, especially when I was in primary in relation to church teachings. So from my earliest memories in primary, I was singing about, I love to see the temple, follow the prophet. The messages were very clear. Obedience equals love. Righteousness equals worth. And those were the same messages that I was getting from very emotionally immature parents as well. The end goal, marry young, go to the temple, become a mother, and that was the pinnacle of divine womanhood. And this is started in primary. But some of the painful things began in primary as well, namely the song, I'm a Child of God. When we would sing, I'm a Child of God in primary, my earliest memory was when I was about 5 or 6. I remember singing about God loving us, I'm a child of God, with parents kind and dear. And in my little childhood brain, being abused and yelled at and screamed at home, I remember thinking, God must not love me because God didn't give me parents kind and dear. And because of that song, I thought all children had kind and dear parents because we're singing about it in church. So I thought I was the only one who was experiencing this kind of thing. And it must have been because God didn't love me. And that was kind of the earliest planting of a seed in my mind that the idea of blessings equating to God's love for you or your obedience or whatever. And so this just started a cascade of scrupulosity and trying to be perfect and obedient and not recognizing that what was happening to me was not caused by God. It wasn't because God didn't love me. But as a 5 or 6-year-old child, I didn't have the tools to even understand that. And this is why a lot of these songs, while they sound really cute and sweet, can be really damaging to children because not all children have the same living experiences at home. So that was my first kind of primary experience. I do remember seeing photos of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, and even at my youngest memories, feeling really uncomfortable. I don't know how to explain it, but just really uncomfortable about them. I didn't like looking at them. I don't know why, but now as an adult, I fully understand why. So in Young Women's, we were given, this is just one of my memories of Young Women's, that infamous licked cupcake lesson. Now realize I'm a lot older than probably most people. And I know a lot of millennials and younger people try to say that a lot of these things didn't happen in the church. They absolutely did. And the licked cupcake lesson was extremely popular. I don't know when it started, but it was definitely popular in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And I don't know after that. But the idea was simple and very devastating. If you broke the law of chastity in any way, and this doesn't mean having sex before marriage. This is kind of anything that happens that they considered breaking the law of chastity. You were like a used cupcake. You were used, unworthy of love, and especially unworthy of a righteous man now. We wrote lists of what we wanted in a future husband, but we never were asked to explore who we were becoming or who we wanted to be in our lives. That was never an option. Our worth was being tied to being a good wife and a good mother for other people. Nothing about our own desires and our own dreams for our own life. General Conference reinforced this idea of wife and mother over and over again through my teen years. Women who worked outside the home were told they were the root of divorce. And this was said right in General Conference, and we'll get into that in a moment. Delaying marriage or children for education was selfish, and our divine role was to serve, always under priesthood authority. Now, we know, again, a lot of young people these days, even people into their 30s, don't remember these messages because they were children. They absolutely were spoken over the pulpit, and I heard them time and time again. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what I was hearing as a young woman. The first one is by President Ezra Taft Benson, The Honored Place of Women, and this was in the October 1981 General Conference. And he says, the seeds of divorce are often sown, and the problems of children begin when mother works outside the home. That was the message. You work outside the home, you're going to have wayward children, and you're going to end up divorced. There it is. There's the proof right there of what we were listening to. Here's another one. President Spencer W. Kimball, Guidelines to Carry Forth the Work of God in Cleanliness. And this was in April 1974 General Conference. And says, it is generally selfish, cold, and self-centered, which leads people to shun marriage responsibility. So again, if you're delaying marriage for your education or you're not wanting to get married, you are selfish, you are cold, you are self-centered. There are people who have concerns about marriage. They have had abusive situations. They have seen their mothers be abused. They have seen all kinds of terrible things happening. We're not addressing why people may not want to, or maybe someone just doesn't want to for their own reasons. But for whatever that reason is, we don't address that. We just shun them. We shame them. And here's another one by Spencer W. Kimball, The Role of Righteous Women. And this was October 1979 General Conference. Do not, however, make the mistake of being drawn off into secondary tasks, which will cause the neglect of your eternal assignments, such as giving birth to and rearing the spirit children of our Father in heaven. So again, it's secondary tasks. You want to go to college, you want to get an education, you want to have a career, you want to do anything else, that's secondary. And you are actually neglecting your assignment from God, which is to give birth and rear children. That is what a woman does. End of story. That is it. That is what I was taught. And these are just a few quotes. There are thousands of them. My parents growing up were perfectionists. They have religious OCD, scrupulosity, probably worse than anyone I have ever seen. And my parents are extremely rigid. My mom has attended every single education week, women's conference, institute classes, attends the temple multiple times a week, and they expect obedience and very strict following of everything the prophet says. When I had 2 ear piercings and they come out in General Conference and say, you should only have 1 pair of earrings, I was expected to take them out. No questions asked. If the prophet said it, we did it. And I wanted to be righteous and obedient. I wanted to be a good person. So I followed. But the religious scrupulosity was extremely unhealthy. And this started in my teen years, where a lot of guilt and a lot of shame, like accidentally slipping and saying a swear word, or even swearing to seem like I was cool in high school and then feeling horribly guilty and like God is going to smite me because I've done something horrible, when it's just kind of a normal teenage thing to do. Even something that simple as saying a few swear words to look cool at school. I can't imagine all of the kids that get so much shame in this religious culture. But as I got a little older in seminary, polygamy cracked something in me. At age 14, I was in 9th grade, this was presented. I believe that we were in D&C that year. It could have been brought up in some other context. Clearly, this was, I don't know how many years ago, well over 35 years ago. So I don't remember, but I believe it was. And it was brought up because D&C 132. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. It haunted me because God is saying, if you don't accept this polygamy, you'll be damned. Emma was brutally condemned if she didn't accept this. And so I couldn't even use the word polygamy at that time. It just gutted me. And so I started calling it human breeding farms. That's just the only way that I could give it a derogatory name to express as a 14-year-old girl how I felt about this. And so that's what I would think. That is what I would say. The idea of a God who would command women to be shared, traded, or collected shattered my sense of divine love. I really looked at this and thought, how could God love women and do this to them, brutalize them in a system where all they were meant to do is give birth to babies for men, sleeping around with all these women? I couldn't make excuses for this. And I never have been able to. And I refuse to make excuses for this type of behavior. If God is all powerful, God could figure out another way. And now that I know polygamous relationships produce far less children than monogamous ones, even that excuse falls flat on its face when you look at statistics. But this was the beginning of my shelf. The metaphor ex-Mormons use to describe that mental space where we put things that don't make sense or are horrible. We're not ready to confront them because it is going to shatter your entire reality. And so you just put it on a shelf and say, I don't understand this. Then came the story of Violet Kimball, which I was told in seminary. This is where Joseph Smith goes to Heber C. Kimball and tells him that his wife Violet must be Joseph Smith's wife. As if women were property to just be traded around like divine baseball cards for celestial trading. And I went home because I was distraught that God would take a woman who loved her husband and was married and say, hey, you're going to be this man's property now. And my mom just brushed it off. She was like, oh, it was a test, like an Abrahamic test. It was, and like that was normal. But I couldn't accept that a loving God would trick people with horrific commands to test their loyalty. That sounded more like a narcissist to me than a loving God. It just did not sit right with me. So again, on the proverbial shelf again. Then I learned about their daughter, Helen Mar Kimball. So Joseph goes, as soon as Heber C. Kimball and his wife agree that the Violet will become Joseph's wife, he's like, psych, never mind. I want your 14-year-old daughter. Again, I was 14 learning this story, and the thought of my parents giving me to a 30-something-year-old man who was already married as a wife ripped my heart out. It was horrifying. And this was the end of the year. I had already actually met my husband at this point. So I have a crush on this boy and we're just starting to like hang out and whatever. And this thought to me of, you know, having a crush on a boy and being a normal 14-year-old girl, the thought of having that robbed from you because you're being forced to marry a 30-year-old man was just heart-wrenching. So I asked my mom about this. I go home and I ask her about this. And she says, oh, it wasn't a real marriage. Her parents just wanted her to be sealed to the prophet in the afterlife and wanted to connect their families. But those excuses only deepened the wound. Why was everyone making peace with something that was so deeply disturbing? Why does God need that? You're going to be in heaven around each other anyway. What is this idea of we're going to be connected? Like, I don't understand that. So you're sealed, but being sealed isn't going to change the space that you occupy in this celestial place. I didn't understand. Mother's Day sacrament meetings couldn't pass without a reminder that the real power in the church came through the priesthood, held only by men. And I remember men speaking in church on Mother's Day and saying mothers are wonderful and all the things, but then they would always bring up the priesthood power so these children could be saved. And it was like, you realize where the real power lies. And celebrating women too much was apparently dangerous to the balance in heaven. We always have to bring in this idea of the power that men have, because we don't want to give women too much. Then came bishops' interviews. So in the beginning, 12 years old, not a huge deal. But by the time I was 15, I had a boyfriend, and he lived across the street from me. So clearly this was well known by ward members and the bishop as well. And in this bishop's interview, he asked me an explicit question about sexual activity. I didn't understand the meaning of what he had asked. I didn't even know what that was. And I remember blushing, feeling really embarrassed, and not knowing fully what it meant. And this was the first time that I realized having a middle-aged man asking teenage girls questions about their intimate lives was extremely inappropriate, and just left this young girl vulnerable to all kinds of inappropriate information and questions that should never be done. No teenage girl should ever be behind a closed door alone with a man, ever. But going through my teenage years, I dated my husband through high school, and granted, there were a few confessions there which were humiliating and full of shame, over really honestly stupid little things that should not have ever even been an issue. But, there's the little, oh, well, we're not going to let you take the sacrament for 2 weeks, which is literally just shaming and gatekeeping Jesus, which we've talked about at other times. When I turned 19, I was almost 20. My husband and I got engaged. And so, of course, we have to do the bishop interview, the stake president interview. And I thought I was just going to be there to answer the same temple recommend questions that the bishop asked me. Instead, he turns around to the whiteboard behind his desk and he starts to draw circles. This one is God to the top one, directly below. This is your husband, and the one off to the side is you. And he drew a line from God to my fiance, and then from my fiance to me. And then he proceeds to say, you have never had a direct connection to God until now. Now that you're getting married, you will have a connection to God through your husband. And it goes like this. And I sat there, heat rising in my face, my stomach turning. Did God not want to talk to me? Did God not want a connection to me? Is this why God wasn't answering my prayers? Because I wasn't male? I was so confused. I never had a connection to God. Why am I praying? Why am I asking for anything? Is God really listening to me? Do I even matter at all? I went home heartbroken. I didn't pray that night. I didn't know if I ever wanted to pray again. Because if God didn't want a connection to me, what was the point of all of this? I told myself in that moment to try to make sense of it, that maybe he was wrong. And maybe he just was some arrogant, chauvinistic guy, some, random whatever. But the temple would soon confirm everything the stake president said. 1 week later, I walked into the temple for the first time. Now, I'm going to go through a little bit of this before I get to the temple confirming what the stake president said. The initiatories at that time, and I know a lot of the younger people try to say this never happened. It did. It absolutely did. The initiatory was deeply triggering to me as a survivor of abuse. So before 2005, you had nothing on. You would go in a locker and they would tell you take everything off and you just had a sheet with a hole in it for your head. It was completely open on the sides. Now, realize you have nothing on, and all this is like a little strip of fabric over the top of you with your head in it. And you are going to walk through the locker room to the initiatory place with open sides, no clothing. I was gripping, trying to close this thing, walking through a locker room of women. It was incredibly humiliating to do that. Then you get into these initiatory booths, and the temple worker is touching you in very intimate places, not directly, but very, very close to places is way too close for comfort. It was an instant dissociation as a survivor of abuse. And I look back on this, there is no consent. They don't tell you what happens. And that is another issue with abuse, is feeling that you are not in control and you don't have the ability to say no. And so I do have a lot of anger that this was ever a thing. And this is one thing that I want to point out here. This is what happens when women's voices are not allowed to be in decision-making places. Because if you had women in the decision-making process for this, they would have said, full stop, no. We are not touching anyone without their consent and without their knowledge prior to. But because women are not in decision-making places, we make really stupid mistakes like this because men don't understand. And I'm just going to leave it at that. Then comes the endowment. Now, I realize they've changed the language today, but I want to be very, very clear. Just because the language is veiled, this covenant has not changed. It's just veiled under language so that you don't understand the meaning of it. But when I went through, I had to covenant to obey the law of my husband. And I want to say that again. I want to be very clear. It was not obey my husband. I had to covenant to obey the law of my husband. Bow your head and say yes. Now, as I'm doing this, I'm sitting here. This is the first thing that I'm being asked to do. And I'm screaming in my mind, no. Like, I do not consent to this. I remember thinking in my mind, I remember like literally prayer in my mind, God, I don't consent to this. I do not covenant this. I will not covenant this. Inside myself, I completely rejected this. This was terrible. I was not going to do it. And then I continue on and I'm asked to veil my face because I don't hold the priesthood. The message was clear. Women were lesser. We had to obey the men. We had to veil our faces during certain portions. And there are many other, you notice Eve doesn't talk. God never talks directly to Eve. God talks to Adam. Everything goes through Adam. And then I saw this point. This is what the stake president was talking about. I had to obey the law of my husband. God never talks directly to Eve other than to condemn her for the choice she made. And the language was a lot stronger many years ago. But after just condemning her, if there is anything else going on, God is talking directly to Adam, and you realize God never addresses women. And I thought, does God even listen to our prayers, or does our husband need to pray for us? Because when you look at the temple endowment, God does not in any way address women. I also noticed there was no Heavenly Mother there. She didn't create anything. She had nothing to do with this, which is a whole other issue later on. But then came a week later, the sealing, my wedding. Now, I want to be clear, none of my siblings were allowed to attend my wedding. I had twin brothers who were only 13 years old, and my baby sister was 9 or 10. So they were just simply too young. I had a beautiful dress. And back in that time, you could wear your wedding dress in the temple, but it was covered by all the ritual clothing. I had my beautiful hair done, spend hours getting ready for your wedding. I didn't have a veil to use anywhere else. So my hair was done in a certain way, which was completely smashed by this stupid veil that I had to wear in the temple. There was no aisle to walk down. There was no ring exchange. There is not even a kiss. Why? Because nothing about this ceremony is about love. It's men that came up with this, and it was just about getting as many wives as they possibly could. They didn't care about it being a beautiful celebratory ceremony, and it 100% is not a celebratory ceremony. The thing that hit me most in the heart, though, as a 19-year-old girl, I met my husband when I was 14. I was head over heels in love with him. And I'm sitting there across this altar with all this weird stuff all over me. And I had to give myself to my husband. And okay, that's fine. And then the sealer says, and you receive her unto yourself. And I'm waiting for him to give himself to me. And it doesn't happen. And in that moment, I am sitting there on my wedding day. And I realize this ceremony is rooted in polygamy. He didn't give himself to me because he could have had any number of wives in eternity that he wanted. I was just one of many possible acquisitions for him. Your husband in the temple is not your own. You are his, but he is not yours. And on my wedding day, during the very ceremony that was supposed to mark the beginning of our life together, my heart shattered. It wasn't sacred. It was eternal betrayal dressed up as holiness. Throughout my 20s and 30s, I heard men in Sunday school claim that polygamy was a requirement for the celestial kingdom. And I would walk out of Sunday school, angry, hurt, confused. I heard this in meetings that I went to, men saying this, oh, my wife isn't here, I can say this. This would break her heart. I heard so many times men make these comments when their wives were not present. And it made me so angry because in these men's hearts, they knew that what they were celebrating would break their wife's heart and they don't care. And I began to wonder if God just hated women. Because this is such a horrific thing to treat women like collector's items without any regard for their feelings, their own desires, or how they feel about this situation at all. The patriarchy in the LDS Church was not hidden. It was everywhere. So I served in a primary presidency. And so the primary president only lived in our ward for 6 months out of the year. And they were a wealthy family, so they had multiple homes. And so when she was living in another home during part of the year, I would attend ward council meetings. And I quickly realized something. Women had no real authority, not even over the organizations we supposedly presided over. We didn't preside over these organizations. We were just pawns. The budgets, the schedules, the girls' camps, the primary programs, every single decision made had to be approved by the men. Even the counselors who served with us had to be cleared by male leaders. And sometimes he would say, no, we're not going to have the leaders you chose. I'm going to choose my own. So we really were a presidency in name only. We didn't make decisions. We didn't do anything. We just kind of facilitated the primary Sunday school situation. And then there was a Heavenly Mother. Supposedly we have one, but the doctrine made her untouchable, too sacred to speak of, too perfect for our sinful lips. Somehow we would defile her if we could speak of her or know of her. We were told we were made in the image of God, yet God was male, always male, father, son, priesthood, prophet, all the things. But I wasn't any of those things. And that was confusing. From the time I was a child, I recognized I'm made in the image of God, but I'm a girl, not a boy. So what does that mean for me? Because I'm not fully in the image of something I don't resemble. And I remember thinking as a young mother, I was the one throwing up 10 times a day when I was pregnant. I was the one that went through surgery when I was 18 weeks pregnant. I was the one that was put on bed rest. I was the one who had surgery at 12 weeks during my second pregnancy and a second surgery at 27 weeks during that pregnancy. I was the one that had to take medication to stop preterm labor that dropped my blood pressure so low I could barely move. I had to crawl upstairs so that I wouldn't fall down and injure myself, all to protect the life that was growing inside of me. And yet in the next life, I was supposed to become a faithless spirit baby making machine, hidden behind the veil of heaven, popping out souls who would never know me, never speak to me, never worship me, I couldn't have contact with. That hurts to the depths of your soul. What is a mother's worst fear? Losing her child and never knowing what happened to them and if they're okay and not being able to contact them. It's a mother's worst fear. And yet that's exactly what the celestial kingdom was. My children would be taken away from me to this earthly place where their hearts would break and they would suffer, and I could do nothing to help them. I couldn't reach out to them. I couldn't talk to them. That didn't sound like celestial glory to me. It sounded like a living hell for eternity. I watched women in my wards. They were the backbone of everything. They organized funerals, cooked meals for grieving families after the funerals, made the food, set the tables, cleaned the kitchen, and still found time to check in on the sick and the exhausted. They ran the activities. They were the ones planning the entire Christmas activities. They were teaching classes. They were mentoring the youth, all while men sat back wielding titles and authority. When I was invited to speak at Relief Society activities, the approval process was outrageous. The Relief Society president was not trusted to choose her own speakers for an activity. She had to submit the names to the bishop, because apparently we aren't spiritually discerning enough to know who could be appropriate to speak. But I had to also be vetted. This bishop would then go to my bishop and ask if I was a worthy temple recommend holder and ask questions about me and if he thought that I might share some false doctrine or something. I had to be proven worthy by two men before I could be allowed to speak at a women's activity. And whenever a woman mentions Heavenly Mother, she will quickly follow it with an apology or a disclaimer. And I started noticing this in the later. We never talked about Heavenly Mother when I was growing up, or even in my teen years. We kind of knew that there was some such thing. But as I got older, women started questioning and talking about it, that you will notice. And I still see this all the time. They will follow it up with an apology or a disclaimer. Of course, we worship Heavenly Father and Jesus, though. They will say it every time, as if just acknowledging Heavenly Mother threatens this male god's ego. Heaven forbid that a Heavenly Mother be talked about in a, positive light without being like, sorry, God, you're okay, though, because we'll worship you. Really? Like, male God is that weak that he can't allow his wife to be respected? It began to feel extremely narcissistic. A God who demands all praise, all glory, all loyalty, and who's going to punish you for asking about your mother. Then came Elder Renlund's 2022 talk, where he rebuked the women for trying to, quote, force revelation about Heavenly Mother. I thought revelation came by asking. Isn't that what Joseph Smith did? Goes out into the woods and asks a question. Is that not what we're supposed to do? And then God reveals the things to us that our hearts are yearning for. These women were not angry. They were not rebellious. They were yearning to know about their divine destiny, about their mother. They were daughters aching to know the divine being they were supposedly destined to become. And that's the moment everything broke for me. I had a big shelf. But when I found out that that's what my eternal destiny was, I told my husband, I don't want to go to the celestial kingdom. I have no interest in going there. I didn't want to live in a place where women were treated like celestial livestock. I didn't want to give birth to spirit children just to have them taken away from me, sent to earth, and cut off from never knowing me. I couldn't comfort them when they suffered. They couldn't pray to me or talk to me or even speak of me without being reprimanded. That's a mother's worst nightmare. Being powerless to reach your children. They're just out of your reach. And that's supposed to be my heaven? Meanwhile, church began to become more unbearable. Unfortunately, I kind of live in a really small town of 250 people, just outside of it. And everyone is related from a couple polygamous families that started this, and they're very proud of it. And they tell those stories in sacrament all the time. And it became incredibly painful. I started noticing 11-year-old boys had more power than I did. They're passing sacrament. They have the power of the administering angels and all of these things. 11-year-old boys have more power than me in my late 40s. Every decision I wanted to make as a woman in the church required male approval. I watched my own daughter suffer on her mission from chronic infections caused by garments made of cheap, unbreathable fabric, and she was in a hot, humid climate, constantly emailing me, "Mom, how do I get rid of these rashes and infections?" She suffered the entire year and a half. And I remembered my own pregnancies, how those garments didn't fit my growing belly. I had preterm labor during both of my pregnancies, very, very high risk. Those tight garments that were made by a man, designed by a man, would squeeze too hard. I couldn't wear them without causing preterm labor. Men are designing women's sacred underwear. I'm sorry, you don't know what women's needs are. That was an absurdity that I just overlooked because they were sacred. After Renlin's talk, I started reading through Gospel Topics essays. I started following Heavenly Mother accounts on Instagram. I really just started feeling disengaged because I felt like I really don't have value here. But at first, I just started reading only church-approved sources. And the women that I was following, they were active members of the church. They were just yearning for Heavenly Mother and asking questions. Until one day, one of the women made a comment that I can no longer be a member of the church. I found some information that made me realize the church isn't true anyway, and I don't have to suffer this anymore. I wanted answers about polygamy, about prophetic fallibility, about blood atonement. And she gave a link, this woman that I was following in her Instagram, and said, "If you want to know what I know, click this link." And it was the CES letter. I didn't know what that was. At first, I dismissed it and thought, oh, it must be anti-Mormon. Of course, I shouldn't read that. We're not supposed to do that. And then I started being curious. I'm like, no, I'm really struggling. I want to know the truth. I just want to know what the truth is. And I was at first determined to prove the CES letter wrong, but I couldn't, because I'd go to the Gospel Topics essays and it would confirm what the CES letter said. I would go to the Joseph Smith papers, the history of the church. Everywhere that I went in an apologetic place, it would confirm to me that, in fact, these things were true. They backed it all up. Every shocking detail and even more. The first vision, the sealing power, the priesthood restoration, the Book of Mormon, all of it fabricated lies, stories, and myths. And I remember sitting there one day seeing that Lyman White had ordained Joseph Smith to the high priesthood, and sitting there shocked and having the realization, I'm reading this in the Joseph Smith papers and realizing it's just not true. And for a moment, it was a relief, because I didn't have to fear dying before my husband and ending up being forced in a polygamous relationship in heaven. I didn't have to fear being some heavenly mother that's locked away from her children somewhere. I didn't have to fear all this crappy situation that women are put into. I also got to realize that I can have a direct connection with God as I start reading the New Testament and realize Jesus ripped the veil in the temple in twain, giving everyone direct access to God, direct access to God's power. I started realizing that all of this is just fabricated lies. I was finally free from the looming weight of polygamy, from a fear of a God who seemed to hate women, oppress women, tell them to sit down and shut up and obey the men. free from chasing impossible standards in a church that would never see me as an equal. Because if you remember, I'll bring it back to the temple. Your husband is a king and priest to the Most High God. He's still in the temple today. You are a queen and a priestess unto your husband. You do not have a direct connection to God. You are a queen and a priestess to your husband. He is your God. Realize that, because that is what it is. His connection is to God, not yours. And when I realized that all of this was just a fabricated religion, it gave me myself back, my sovereignty, my power as a woman, my value as a woman. That freedom does come at a cost, because there are loss of family relationships. There's a loss of respect. You lose your community. People at the store will turn their heads. They don't want to look at you. They don't want to talk to you. They're afraid of you. They see you as deceived. You have people show up on your doorstep bearing their testimony to you, accusing you of being offended by ward members. It's not easy. But at the end of the day, I wouldn't trade it for anything, because I am sovereign. And I know that I am powerful within my own self and my own right and my own connection to a God in any way that I see it. And I am not under this oppressive control anymore. And that's my story.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. And I guess it's time for my story now. So I grew up in a family that was also deeply committed to the LDS Church. And from a young age, I held several callings, including serving in quorum presidencies for both deacons and teachers. There was a calling for assisting special needs individuals in the stake. And on the surface, I was a model young member, but my faith began to waver when I was about 15 or 16 years old. That year, we were going over church history during seminary, and I remembered one student asked about the Meadows Massacre, and how church leaders could have allowed such a horrific event. And our seminary teacher just dismissed the question, saying that he didn't know the answer, but we needed to have faith in God's plan. And I wasn't a fan of that response, so I decided to do my own research, because if he didn't know the answer, I sure wanted to find an answer for myself. And what I found left me horrified. Learning about the massacre and the church's involvement was appalling. And when I approached my bishop about it, he gave me the same answer, to just have faith. And he suggested that there might even be a divine reason behind the massacre. That also didn't sit well with me. But as we were all told to do, I set my doubts aside. I doubted my doubts before I doubted my faith, assuming I wasn't in a position to question God's plan. And he brushed off deeply disturbing doctrines like they were nothing. And I remember leaving those meetings confused and unsettled. Like, why wasn't any of these issues a big deal to anyone else? And why do I feel so wrong to even care about it? For a while, I tried to put those questions on the shelf like everyone said I should. I buried myself in seminary and church callings, telling myself that if I just worked harder or prayed more or studied the scriptures more, the answers would come. But they never did. In fact, the more I learned about church history, the worse it got. I'd be in Sunday school hearing about how Joseph Smith was a martyred prophet, and I'd be thinking about the 14-year-olds he was secretly marrying. I'd sit in sacrament meeting hearing talks about obedience while wrestling with the facts that Brigham Young openly preached blood atonements. Nothing about the church's history aligns with the values I was taught to hold dear. Between the ages of 16 and 17, I began questioning more and more. I had countless meetings with my bishop and other church leaders because I wanted to know more about these discrepancies in the scripture with polygamy, about the priesthood ban for black members, and many other topics. And every time the answer was the same. It was to just have faith. It became a full-blown pattern. No one could provide a real answer. The constant dismissal was very frustrating, and I started attending church less frequently. I would still go to sacrament meeting, but I would leave immediately afterward. And my absence didn't go unnoticed. Other young men often came to my house, urging me to join them for activities or return to church. And at first, I made excuses of not feeling well, but eventually I gave in and attended a weekday activity. And just before the activity started, the bishop pulled me aside to ask why I had been absent. I explained that I was struggling with many of the church's teachings, and I was trying to figure things out. And his response was very dismissive. He insisted that I needed to keep attending church to understand God's plan. And when I brought up troubling aspects of church history, he said that we couldn't judge past actions because we didn't know the full circumstances or what the victims might have done to deserve what happened to them. And I hated that answer more than any of the other ones I got. It's like, what the victims may have done to deserve it? That did not sit well with me. And honestly, that conversation just pushed me further away. And when I turned 18, the pressure to serve a mission became overwhelming. My bishop, my family, my friends were relentless. But I could not reconcile my doubts. And I was thinking there's no way I can go serve a mission and preach the gospel when I was having very serious questions about the gospel. It just didn't feel right. I did end up starting my papers and when people would ask, I'd be like, yes, I have started my papers. I'm working on them. But again, it just wasn't feeling right about going out and teaching a doctrine that I was strongly questioning. And when people started asking why I never finished my papers, I kept dodging the questions, saying, oh, I just had a couple doctor's appointments left, or I just have this left, or that I was waiting on something. And there were a few people who were aware of my faith struggles, and one of them told me to read President Uchtdorf's talk, Come Join With Us. And in that talk, he says, doubt your doubts before you doubt your faith. And I guess this person thought it would help push me forward and get me on my mission. But honestly, it had the opposite effect. It honestly felt like gaslighting. If the church was really true, why couldn't it be able to stand up against scrutiny? Shouldn't it actually be able to answer doubts instead of just dismissing them? Eventually, I started saying that I couldn't go on my mission due to health reasons. And that was kind of true. I just failed to mention that it was my spiritual health struggling and not my physical health. And I was very careful with how I worded that, so I technically wasn't lying. And this finally got people to stop asking. And not long after that, I moved out into my first apartment, moved out on my own. And I thought it would be a fresh start, but the church followed me. The ward clerk from my previous ward, who also happened to be a coworker, he knew where I moved to, and he automatically transferred my records to my new singles ward. And because he knew where I moved since we worked together. So I received a text from the bishop, and I'm like, you know what, fine. I'll start attending church again, and I did go a couple times, trying to convince myself to give it one more shot. But honestly, that singles ward was toxic, gossipy, cliquish. It was a very toxic ward in general. And I stopped going pretty quickly, but the guilt never did go away. I tried to compensate by doing personal scripture study and praying on my own. I was terrified of losing the spirits, and thought maybe if I just tried harder on my own, I could still stay worthy enough. And the LDS Quorum president did reach out to me a few times, but it was never to check in to see how I was doing, how things were going. It was the only messages I got from him were to remind me it was my turn to go clean the church building. And that was the extent of the outreach. No, how are you? But don't forget to scrub the toilets. My shelf finally broke when I was dog sitting for a close relative, who I always viewed as a strong, faithful church member. And they gave me access to their computer for schoolwork. And one day I accidentally clicked on an open tab to a Google Drive folder, and I saw the folder was titled LDS Church Not True. And I immediately switched to another tab because, first off, I didn't want to snoop, and also, I was always told you shouldn't look at stuff like that. But as the days went on, I got more and more curious, so eventually I opened it again. And I was expecting some sketchy ex-Mormon blog posts or angry rants or some crazy stuff. But instead, it was full of quotes from church leaders, gospel topics essays, and documents from the Joseph Smith papers or BYU studies. These weren't just rumors. They were facts straight from church-approved sources. And I couldn't believe that I've never heard of any of this stuff before, either over the pulpit, in Sunday school, in seminary. So I decided to share this folder with myself so I could take a deeper look later. And a few weeks passed, and this relative eventually noticed that I had shared the folder with myself, and they gave me a call. And they weren't upset. In fact, they called me to ask if I wanted to talk about anything. And we ended up having multiple hours-long conversation over the next couple weeks. And I asked every question I had bottled up for years, and they answered everything with compassion, patience, and honesty. And suddenly, everything that felt so heavy previously started to feel much, much lighter. The guilt I had carried for not going on mission, for not being spiritual enough, for not fitting the perfect member mold, it all finally started to melt away. I realized that I wasn't broken. I had just been living in a system that punished doubt and rewarded silence. And I was inspired by all this, so I decided to do my own deep dive into church history. I was reading the Gossip Topics essays, I found the CES letter, I was going through the Joseph Smith papers. I found every bit of church history that I could get my hands on. And the more I learned, the clearer it became that the church had a pattern of dishonesty, whitewashing its own history, and excusing very harmful behavior. The essays often downplayed or excused these actions that should have been condemned outright. And leaving the church has both been freeing and confusing. When I first left, I tried other Christian denominations, other Christian churches, to see if I could find a spiritual home elsewhere. But I quickly realized that many of these other churches also endorsed harmful teachings or operated as little more than profit-driven organizations, just like the LDS Church. And I'm still figuring out what I believe. And honestly, anyone else that's in the same spot, that's okay. But the difference now is that I get to decide for myself. I get to explore, I get to ask questions, and I get to live honestly. There's no checklist to measure my worth, no bishop to confess to, no fear of disappointing a God I was taught to fear more than love. And honestly, the coffee's great. I love it. Having a second Saturday, also great. But the thing I enjoy most is finally feeling free and like I'm living a life that's my own and not being constantly controlled by the church. And eventually I stopped identifying as a member of the LDS Church, and now I live my life outside of religion, outside of focusing on being, now I'm focusing on being a good person and seeking truth for myself. And the journey has been challenging, but stepping away from the church has brought me an immense sense of clarity and peace that I never thought was previously possible. I'd like to thank everyone so much for watching, and if you want your story featured in a future episode, make sure to email us at stories@churchexpositor.com, and we may feature it in a future episode. Also, make sure you check out our website. We got a bunch of wonderful merch on there, and there will be a big update coming to that website soon, so stay tuned. And we also have a Substack link down below in the description with a bunch of fantastic articles. But for now, I'll look forward to see you guys next time. Bye-bye.